The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Westfield Academy of Arts, casting long shadows across the polished floor of the main hall. The prestigious school was quiet now, with most students and teachers having left for the day. Only the gentle hum of a vacuum cleaner broke the silence as Eduardo Rodriguez, the school's janitor for the past 8 years, worked his way methodically across the room. At 58, Eduardo's body showed the wear of decades of physical labor. His salt and pepper hair was always neatly combed, and despite the demanding nature of his work, he took pride in wearing a clean, pressed uniform each day. The students and teachers rarely noticed him. He had mastered the art of being invisible, moving through the halls like a shadow, making messes disappear without drawing attention to himself. But today, as he finished vacuuming and began dusting the grand piano that stood majestically in the center of the hall, Eduardo's thoughts drifted back to another time and place. The magnificent Steinway concert grand had always been his favorite object to clean in the entire school. He treated it with special care, using a soft cloth to gently wipe away fingerprints from its gleaming black surface. 8 years cleaning you, he whispered to the piano in Spanish. And still the most beautiful thing in this building. Eduardo glanced around the empty hall. The clock on the wall showed 6:15 p.m. The security guard wouldn't make his rounds for another hour, and the night cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until 8 door. For a brief moment, he was completely alone with the piano, a rare opportunity. His fingers hovered over the keys. It had been weeks since he'd last allowed himself this small pleasure. With a deep breath, Eduardo carefully set his cleaning supplies aside and lowered himself onto the bench. The weight of the day seemed to lift from his shoulders as his fingers found their home position on the keys. For a moment he just sat there, eyes closed, remembering. Then almost of their own accord his hands began to move. The notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the hall. The piece had been his mother's favorite. Eduardo could still picture her small kitchen in their home outside Mexico City, how she would hum along to the melody on the crackling radio while preparing dinner. His fingers moved with surprising agility, muscle memory taking over where formal training had left off decades ago. Eduardo had been just 6 years old when his uncle had brought home an old upright piano he'd found abandoned behind a music school. The instrument was badly out of tune, with several keys that stuck and others that didn't work at all. But to young Eduardo, it might as well have been a treasure from heaven. Without lessons or sheet music, he had taught himself to play by ear, listening to classical radio stations and mimicking what he heard. By 16, his talent had caught the attention of a visiting music teacher, who arranged for him to attend a conservatory in Mexico City on scholarship. For 2 glorious years, Eduardo had flourished, finally receiving proper training and dreaming of concert halls. But then his father had fallen ill, and the family needed money more than they needed a pianist. The conservatory dreams ended as abruptly as they had begun. Now decades later in a country far from home, Eduardo played not with the technical precision of his conservatory days, but with something perhaps more valuable, the emotion of a life fully lived, with all its joys and sorrows. His weathered hands coaxed a melancholy beauty from the keys that spoke of dreams deferred and simple pleasures cherished. So lost was he in the music that Eduardo didn't notice the main door opening, didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching from behind. It wasn't until he finished the piece, the final notes hanging in the air like a lingering sigh, that he heard a small gasp. Eduardo turned quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment. Standing just a few feet away was Sophia Harrington, the 16-year-old daughter of Richard Harrington, the Academy's largest donor. Her long blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the school's expensive uniform with the ease of someone who had never known anything different. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Eduardo stood hastily, nearly knocking over the bench. "I was just cleaning and That was beautiful," Sophia said, her eyes wide. "That was Chopin, wasn't it? The E-flat Nocturne?" Eduardo nodded, surprised by her recognition of the piece. "Yes, miss. I'm sorry for using the piano. I know I shouldn't have." "No, please," Sophia held up a hand. "I've been playing that piece for my recital, but it never sounded like that when I played it." She approached the piano cautiously, as if worried Eduardo might flee. "You played differently." Eduardo shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of the contrast between them. Her in her crisp uniform that cost more than his monthly salary, him in his work clothes with maintenance staff embroidered on the pocket. "I should get back to work," he said, reaching for his cleaning supplies. "Wait," Sophia said. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "Who was your teacher?" Eduardo hesitated. In 8 years at Westfield Academy, this was perhaps the longest conversation he'd had with any student. Most didn't even make eye contact when passing him in the halls. "I had no real teacher," he admitted. "Just 2 years at a school in Mexico a long time ago. Mostly I taught myself." Sophia's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Self-taught?" "But that's—" she seemed to struggle for words. "That's incredible. The emotion in your playing?" Eduardo smiled slightly, embarrassed by the praise but also touched by it. "Music is just feelings given sound, no? You can learn the notes from books, but the feeling must come from here." He placed a hand over his heart. Sophia looked at the piano thoughtfully. "That's what my teacher keeps telling me. She says my technique is good, but I play like a robot." She glanced at Eduardo. "I'm supposed to perform that nocturne at the donor recital tomorrow evening. My parents have invited all their friends." The mention of the recital made Eduardo suddenly remember where he was and who he was talking to. This wasn't just any student. This was the Harrington's daughter. Mr. Harrington had donated the very piano Eduardo had been playing. "I really should finish my work." "Miss," he said more firmly, picking up his dusting cloth, "I wasn't supposed to touch the piano except to clean it. But, Sophia, are you in here?" A sharp, authoritative voice called from the entrance of the hall. Both Eduardo and Sophia turned to see Mrs. Victoria Harrington striding toward them, her high heels clicking loudly on the polished floor. She was a tall, imposing woman in an expensive suit, her blonde hair styled in a perfect bob. "Mother, I just came back for my sheet music," Sophia explained quickly. "I left it after practice." Mrs. Harrington's eyes narrowed as she looked from her daughter to Eduardo. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone making it clear that she found something inappropriate about the situation. "Yes, ma'am," Eduardo said quickly, lowering his gaze and stepping back from the piano. "I was just finishing up the cleaning." Mrs. Harrington barely acknowledged him with a nod before turning to her daughter. "Well, do you have your music? The car is waiting and we have dinner reservations at 7. Sophia hesitated for a moment, glancing at Eduardo. "Yes, I have it," she said, holding up a folder Eduardo hadn't noticed before. As her mother turned to leave, Sophia mouthed a quick thank you to Eduardo before following. Eduardo stood motionless for a moment after they left, the hall suddenly feeling emptier than before. With a sigh, he returned to his cleaning cart. That brief connection, being seen, being heard, had been unexpected and oddly moving. But he knew better than to dwell on it. Tomorrow, Sophia would return to being just another student who looked through him rather than at him. And he would return to being invisible. As he pushed his cart toward the next room that needed cleaning, Eduardo couldn't help but wonder what the girl had meant by thanking him. For playing? For stopping when her mother arrived? Perhaps for showing her that music could be more than just perfect technique. Whatever the reason, he doubted their paths would cross in any meaningful way again. Westfield Academy was a place of strict social boundaries that separated donor families from maintenance staff as surely as if they lived in different worlds. Eduardo glanced back once at the grand piano, now silently gleaming in the fading light. For a brief moment he had forgotten those boundaries. Tomorrow he would remember his place. But for now, the memory of Chopin's notes still lingered in the air, a small reminder of the young man he had once been, and the dreams he had once held. Little did Eduardo know that his encounter with Sophia would set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. By this time tomorrow, the carefully maintained social order of Westfield Academy would be turned upside down, and the invisible janitor would suddenly find himself the center of attention in ways he could never have imagined. The next day arrived, with the nervous energy that always accompanied special events at Westfield Academy. The annual donor recital wasn't just any performance. It was a carefully orchestrated display of the school's prestige, a chance for wealthy parents to see their investments in action through their children's talents. For the students, it was an opportunity to shine. For the staff, it meant extra hours of preparation and a strict attention to detail that left no room for error. Eduardo arrived at work earlier than usual, determined to have the main hall looking immaculate for the evening's event. He had slept poorly. He avoided the main hall where the recital was taking place, focusing instead on the parking areas and entranceways where he wouldn't encounter any of the guests who had witnessed his humiliation. As the evening wore on, the sounds of applause occasionally drifted through the building, marking the end of each student's performance. Eduardo imagined Sofia at the piano, playing the Chopin piece they had discussed. He wondered if she had found the emotion in the music that she felt was missing from her playing. Part of him wanted to hear her performance, to know if their brief interaction had made any difference. But a stronger part knew it was better to keep his distance. At 10 o'clock, with the recital long finished and the building finally empty, Eduardo completed his final tasks for the night. The other maintenance workers had already left, eager to start their weekend. Eduardo preferred these quiet moments alone in the school, when he could move through the hallways without feeling like a shadow, without needing to make himself smaller to avoid notice. He saved the main hall for last, wanting to make sure it was spotless for the morning. The caterers had done a decent job cleaning up after themselves, but there were still napkins tucked between seat cushions and champagne glasses hidden behind potted plants. Eduardo worked his way methodically around the room, gathering trash and wiping down surfaces. When he reached the piano, he paused. For a moment, he allowed his fingers to hover above the keys, not touching them, simply feeling the pull of the instrument. Then, with a small sigh, he picked up his cleaning cloth and gently wiped down the glossy surface, careful not to press too hard. "You play beautifully, you know." The voice startled him so badly that he nearly knocked over his cleaning cart. Eduardo spun around to find Mr. Harrington standing in the doorway of the hall, his tie loosened and his jacket draped over one arm. "I'm sorry, sir," Eduardo said quickly, stepping away from the piano. "I was just cleaning." Mr. Harrington held up a hand. "It's fine. I know you were just doing your job." He walked further into the room, approaching the piano. "My daughter told me she heard you playing yesterday. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, I believe." Eduardo nodded cautiously, unsure where this conversation was headed. "Yes, sir. That was my mother's favorite piece," Mr. Harrington said, running his hand lightly along the edge of the piano. "She played it often when I was a boy. Not as well as you, according to Sofia." Eduardo remained silent, watching the older man carefully. Unlike his wife, Richard Harrington had always treated the school staff with basic courtesy, if somewhat distant politeness. "My wife?" Mr. Harrington began, then paused. "Victoria can be protective of certain things. The piano, Sofia's music education. I want to apologize for how she spoke to you earlier." Eduardo straightened his shoulders slightly. "Thank you, sir, but it's not necessary. I understand that I overstepped." Mr. Harrington studied him for a moment. "Where did you learn to play?" "Sofia said you mentioned studying briefly in Mexico." The question caught Eduardo off guard. It had been years since anyone had asked him about his past, about the person he had been before he became just another invisible worker. "Yes, at the National Conservatory in Mexico City," Eduardo said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so many years. "Just for 2 years, a long time ago." "The National Conservatory?" Mr. Harrington looked genuinely surprised. "That's a prestigious institution. What happened after those 2 years?" Eduardo hesitated. He rarely spoke about his past, had learned that most people weren't interested in the stories of the people who cleaned their spaces. But something in Mr. Harrington's expression seemed genuinely curious. "My father became very sick," Eduardo said simply. "My family needed money more than they needed a pianist, so I left school to work." He gave a small shrug. "Life happens this way sometimes." Mr. Harrington nodded slowly. "Yes, it does." He looked at Eduardo with new interest. "And how did you end up here at Westfield Academy?" "I came to America 23 years ago," Eduardo said. "I wanted my daughter to have opportunities I didn't have. She's studying computer science at Berkeley now." A small smile of pride crossed his face despite his attempt to remain neutral. "I've worked many jobs. The position here at Westfield has good benefits, stable hours. Your daughter is at Berkeley?" Mr. Harrington seemed impressed. "That's excellent. You must be very proud." "Yes," Eduardo agreed, the familiar warmth spreading through his chest whenever he thought of his daughter's achievements. "Very proud. She graduates next spring." Mr. Harrington glanced at the piano, then back at Eduardo. "Would you play something for me?" "I'd like to hear for myself what impressed my daughter so much." Eduardo's heart quickened. "Sir, I don't think that would be appropriate, considering what Mrs. Harrington said." Victoria isn't here, Mr. Harrington said with a slight smile. And it's my name on the donation plaque after all. Eduardo hesitated, torn between caution and the unexpected opportunity to play the magnificent instrument one more time. Just one short piece? Mr. Harrington gestured toward the piano bench. Please. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Eduardo set down his cleaning cloth and sat at the piano. His hands settled naturally on the keys, and after a moment of consideration, he began to play. Not Chopin this time, but a piece by Mexican composer Manuel Ponce, Intermezzo No. 1, a hauntingly beautiful melody that spoke of longing and distant memories. As he played, Eduardo allowed himself to be transported back to his youth, to the small practice rooms at the conservatory where he had spent countless hours perfecting his technique. He remembered his teacher, an elderly man with gnarled hands who had seen something special in the self-taught boy from a poor neighborhood. You play not just with your fingers, but with your soul, the old man had told him. That cannot be taught. When the final notes faded away, Eduardo remained still for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the keys. Then, remembering himself, he quickly stood and stepped away from the piano. Mr. Harrington was watching him with an unreadable expression. That was extraordinary, he said finally. Truly. May I ask why you never pursued music professionally? After the conservatory, I mean. Eduardo gave a small, sad smile. Dreams are expensive, Mr. Harrington, and reality has a way of demanding payment. I understand that better than you might think, Mr. Harrington said quietly. He seemed about to say more when his phone buzzed. He checked it quickly. I need to go. Victoria's waiting in the car. He extended his hand to Eduardo. Thank you for sharing your music. Surprised, Eduardo shook the offered hand. Thank you for listening, sir. After Mr. Harrington left, Eduardo finished cleaning in thoughtful silence. The unexpected conversation had stirred memories he usually kept carefully tucked away. As he drove home that night to his small apartment in the less fashionable part of town, his mind was filled not with the humiliation of the evening, but with bittersweet recollections of what might have been. The apartment was dark when he arrived home. Eduardo moved through the familiar space with practiced ease, setting his keys on the small table by the door and hanging his jacket on the hook behind it. He warmed up leftover soup for a late dinner, eating at the tiny kitchen table while scrolling through his phone to check for messages from his daughter. There was one new text. Call me when you get home. Papa, no matter how late. Eduardo frowned slightly. It wasn't like Lucia to ask him to call so late unless something was wrong. He quickly dialed her number. Papa! Lucia's voice came through sounding excited rather than worried. How was the fancy recital tonight? Eduardo hesitated, unsure how much to share about the evening's events. It was fine, he said finally. Just another work day. Why are you still awake so late? Is everything okay? Everything is amazing, Lucia said. I got the internship. The one at Google I told you about. Full pay, and they said it could turn into a job offer after graduation. Pride bloomed in Eduardo's chest, momentarily washing away all the evening's discomfort. Que maravilloso. I am so proud of you, Mia. So proud. It's all because of you, Papa, Lucia said, her voice growing serious. All those extra shifts you took, all those years of sending money for my books and my laptop. This is your achievement too. Eduardo's eyes grew damp. No, Lucia. This is all you. Your hard work, your brilliant mind. Well, I didn't get my stubbornness from nowhere, she laughed. Remember how you used to tell me about your piano teacher at the conservatory? How he said you were the most determined student he ever had. Eduardo was surprised she remembered those stories. He had told them years ago when Lucia was still a child and they would sit together on their small balcony in the evenings. Sharing stories as the sun set, I remember, he said softly. You gave up everything for me, Papa. Lucia continued. Your music, your dreams. I've never forgotten that. And I would do it again, Eduardo said firmly. 1,000 times over. Seeing you succeed, that is worth more than any applause I might have received. They talked a while longer about the details of the internship, about Lucia's upcoming finals, about her roommate's new puppy. When they finally said goodnight, Eduardo sat in the quiet apartment, his heart full. On the wall above his small dining table hung a framed photograph, the only visible connection to his past life. It showed a much younger Eduardo standing outside the National Conservatory, his arm around an elderly man with kin, eyes and a stern mouth. His teacher, Maestro Ortiz, on the last day they had seen each other. Your hands were made for Chopin, the old man had told him that day, knowing Eduardo was leaving the conservatory. But your heart was made for something even greater, I think. At the time, Eduardo hadn't understood what his teacher meant. Looking at the photograph now, thinking of Lucia and her achievements, he thought perhaps he finally did. As he prepared for bed, Eduardo wondered what Victoria Harrington would think if she knew the truth about the janitor she had so casually humiliated. Would it matter to her that he had once been considered a promising talent, that renowned teachers had praised his natural musicality? Probably not, he decided. In her world, what mattered was what you were now, not what you might have been. Eduardo set his alarm for the morning. He had agreed to cover a colleague's Saturday shift and lay down on his bed with a sigh. Tomorrow would be another day of invisible work, of moving through the world with his head down, of being seen without being noticed. But for tonight at least he had been seen, truly seen by both a curious teenage girl and her wealthy father. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small spark of something long dormant began to flicker back to life. The weekend passed quietly for Eduardo. Saturday was spent covering his colleague's shift at the school, mopping floors and repairing a leaky faucet in the teacher's lounge. Sunday was his usual routine: morning mass at St. Catherine's, a video call with Lucia, and a few hours at the community garden where he tended a small plot of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. By Monday morning, the events of Friday night had begun to fade in his mind, relegated to just another uncomfortable memory in a lifetime full of them. He arrived at Westfield Academy at his usual time, parking his aging Honda in the far corner of the staff lot. The school was already buzzing with activity, students streaming through the main entrance, their voices filling the hallways with morning chatter. Eduardo nodded politely to a few teachers as he made his way to the maintenance office to check his daily assignment sheet. Rodriguez, the head of maintenance, a burly man named Frank, called out as Eduardo entered. "You're on auditorium duty today. They're having some big music showcase this afternoon." Eduardo felt a slight tightening in his chest. The auditorium meant potentially crossing paths with Mrs. Harrington again, or worse, Sophia. He had hoped for a few more days of working in other areas of the school, allowing the memory of his humiliation to fade further. "Is there something else I could do today?" he asked quietly. "Perhaps the science wing?" Frank looked up from his clipboard with a frown. "Jenkins is handling science. We need someone experienced for the auditorium setup. The music department requested you specifically." He narrowed his eyes. "Is there a problem?" "No," Eduardo said quickly. "No problem. I'll head there now." As he gathered his supplies and pushed his cart toward the auditorium, Eduardo wondered why the music department would have asked for him by name. After Friday's incident, he would have expected them to want him as far from their precious instruments as possible. The auditorium was empty when he arrived. The stage lights dimmed. Unlike the grand hall where the donor recital had taken place, the auditorium was larger and more functional, with rows of padded seats facing a wide stage. On the center of the stage stood another piano, not the Steinway from the hall, but still a fine instrument. Eduardo began his work quietly, checking the lighting, making sure the seating was properly arranged, and ensuring the backstage areas were clean and organized. He had just finished vacuuming between the rows when he heard the auditorium doors open. Looking up, he saw Mrs. Chen entering, accompanied by several students carrying instrument cases. "Ah, Mr. Rodriguez," she said, spotting him. "Thank you for coming. We have the spring showcase this afternoon. It's open to all students, not just the advanced ones like Friday's recital." She glanced around the auditorium appreciatively. "Everything looks wonderful." "Thank you, ma'am," Eduardo said, somewhat confused by her friendly tone after Friday's events. "Is there anything specific you need help with?" "Yes, actually," Mrs. Chen said, lowering her voice slightly. "One of our piano benches has a wobbly leg. I remember you're quite handy with repairs. Could you take a look at it before the showcase begins?" "Of course," Eduardo nodded, relieved to have a straightforward task that would keep him busy and out of sight. The morning passed quickly as Eduardo fixed the piano bench and helped arrange music stands on the stage. More students began to arrive, filling the backstage area with nervous energy as they practiced their pieces and adjusted their instruments. Eduardo worked efficiently, keeping to himself and avoiding unnecessary interaction. At noon, he was just finishing his lunch in the small break room when Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway looking flustered. "Mr. Rodriguez, I hate to interrupt your break, but we have a situation. Our opening performer, Thomas, has come down with terrible stage fright. He's in the bathroom being physically ill and his parents are taking him home." Eduardo wiped his mouth with a napkin. "I'm sorry to hear that. How can I help?" "We need to rearrange the program quickly," Mrs. Chen explained. "Could you help me move some of the heavier instruments? We'll need to change the stage setup now that we're starting with a different performance." "Of course," Eduardo said, standing up and following her back to the auditorium. The backstage area was in controlled chaos when they arrived. Students huddled in small groups, whispering anxiously about the change in program. Teachers moved about, checking lists and reassuring nervous performers. Eduardo spotted Sophia sitting alone on a equipment trunk, staring intently at her sheet music. Mrs. Chen directed Eduardo to move several large standing percussion instruments to the back of the stage. As he worked, he couldn't help overhearing snippets of conversation around him. "Who's going to open now? It has to be someone confident, maybe Sophia. She's the most experienced." Eduardo glanced again at Sophia, noticing how pale she looked, her fingers tapping restlessly against her music folder. She didn't look confident at all. She looked terrified. The auditorium began to fill with audience members, parents, other students, and faculty. Eduardo, having finished the requested tasks, prepared to retreat to the back of the room where he could monitor things without being noticed. As he passed near Sophia, he heard her practicing under her breath, counting beats and mumbling notes to herself. Without thinking, Eduardo paused. "The music is not in the notes," he said softly in Spanish, then repeated in English, "but in the silence between them." Sophia looked up, startled. "What?" "Something my teacher used to say," Eduardo explained, immediately regretting having spoken. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have interrupted." "No, it's okay," Sophia said quickly. "What does it mean?" Eduardo hesitated, aware that others might notice them talking. "It means that technical perfection is not enough. The emotion comes from how you connect the notes, from the space you create between them." He gestured vaguely. "From inside you." Sophia stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. Eduardo nodded once and continued on his way, disappearing into the shadows at the back of the auditorium, just as the lights began to dim for the start of the showcase. Mrs. Chen walked onto the stage, microphone in hand. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Westfield Academy's Spring Music Showcase. We have a slight change to our program today. Our opening performer is unable to perform, so we'll be starting with, excuse me, Mrs. Chen." The voice, clear and determined, came from the side of the stage. Sophia stepped forward, still clutching her music folder. "Before we begin," she said, her voice carrying across the now quiet auditorium, "I'd like to request something." Mrs. Chen looked surprised but handed her the microphone. "Of course, Sophia." Sophia took a deep breath, scanning the audience. Eduardo could see her parents in the front row, Victoria looking puzzled, Richard watching with interest. "As many of you know, I've been studying piano for 10 years, Sophia began. "I've had the best teachers, the best instruments, every advantage possible." She paused. "But 2 days ago, I heard someone play with more feeling and true understanding of music than I've ever managed, despite all my lessons." A murmur ran through the audience. Eduardo felt his heart begin to beat faster. "That person," Sophia continued, "is here today. He works at our school, keeping it beautiful and functioning for all of us, though most of us hardly notice him." She turned, looking directly toward the back where Eduardo stood frozen in the shadows. "Mr. Rodriguez, would you please come to the stage?" Eduardo felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. Every instinct told him to turn and walk out the door to avoid whatever was about to happen. But something in Sophia's expression, earnest, hopeful, determined, kept him rooted to the spot. "Please," Sophia said into the microphone. "I'd like to ask Mr. Rodriguez to play the opening piece for our showcase today." The auditorium filled with whispers as heads turned, searching for the janitor. Eduardo saw Victoria Harrington's face turn from confusion to shock to outrage. Richard placed a restraining hand on his wife's arm, leaning in to whisper something to her. Mrs. Chen had moved to the side of the stage, looking completely bewildered. Several teachers exchanged concerned glances. The students backstage had crowded forward to see what was happening. Slowly, feeling as though he were moving through a dream, Eduardo made his way down the center aisle toward the stage. The whispers grew louder as people recognized the maintenance worker in his gray uniform. "Is this some kind of joke?" he heard someone mutter. "What is Sophia Harrington thinking?" came another voice. As he reached the steps to the stage, Eduardo hesitated. This was madness. He hadn't performed in front of an audience in over 30 years. He wasn't dressed for a recital. He didn't belong on that stage, but Sophia was waiting at the top of the steps, hand extended. "Please," she said, no longer using the microphone, speaking just to him. "Show them what you showed me." Eduardo looked past her to the gleaming piano at center stage, then back to her face. Young, privileged, but somehow understanding something important about music that many of her wealthy, well-educated peers had missed. He climbed the steps slowly. The auditorium had fallen completely silent. Taking the microphone from Sophia, Eduardo cleared his throat. "I am not a performer," he said simply. "I am the janitor. But before that, a long time ago, I was a pianist. If you will allow me, I would like to play for you." Without waiting for a response, he handed the microphone back to Sophia and walked to the piano. He sat down carefully, adjusting the bench that he himself had repaired earlier that day. His hands hovered above the keys for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. Then, in the hushed auditorium, Eduardo began to play. He chose Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, a piece that told a story through its music, beginning softly, building through complex emotions, reaching moments of both delicate beauty and thunderous power. It was a challenging piece, one he had practiced countless times in his youth but hadn't played in full for decades. Yet somehow, his fingers remembered. They found the keys with surprising accuracy, muscle memory awakening after years of dormancy. There were small mistakes here and there, moments where technique failed him after so many years without proper practice. But what his playing lacked in technical perfection, it made up for in something far rarer, the pure, unfiltered emotion of a life lived with both joy and sorrow, with dreams both fulfilled and abandoned. As the music filled the auditorium, Eduardo closed his eyes, losing himself in the piece. He forgot about the audience, about Victoria Harrington's disapproval, about his worn uniform and calloused hands. For those minutes, he was not the invisible janitor, but simply a man sharing the music that had lived in his heart for a lifetime. When the final notes faded away, Eduardo remained still for a moment, eyes still closed, hands resting lightly on the keys. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then, like a wave breaking, applause erupted throughout the auditorium. Eduardo opened his eyes to see the audience on their feet, their faces registering shock, delight, and in some cases, tears. In the front row, Richard Harrington was applauding enthusiastically while Victoria stood beside him, her expression unreadable. As Eduardo stood and gave a small, awkward bow, he caught sight of Sophia standing in the wings, smiling through tears. And in that moment, something that had been tightly closed within him for 30 years finally broke open, allowing him to glimpse once more the young man he had been, the dreams he had set aside, and the music that had never truly left him. The applause seemed to go on forever. Eduardo stood awkwardly by the piano, unused to being the center of attention, especially positive attention. Several students backstage had peeked out to witness the standing ovation, their faces showing a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. Mrs. Chen had tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. When the applause finally began to die down, Eduardo gave one more small bow and turned to leave the stage. As he did, he locked eyes with Victoria Harrington in the front row. Her expression had shifted from its initial shock to something more complex, a reluctant admiration mixed with embarrassment. Beside her, Richard was beaming, clapping enthusiastically until his hands must have hurt. Sophia met Eduardo at the side of the stage, her eyes shining. "That was incredible," she whispered. "Even better than when I first heard you play." "Thank you for your kindness," Eduardo replied softly. "But I should get back to work now." "Work?" Sophia looked incredulous. "After that? You can't just go back to mopping floors." Eduardo gave her a gentle smile. "That is my job, Sophia, and there is dignity in all honest work." Before Sophia could respond, Mrs. Chen approached, still dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Mr. Rodriguez, that was—" "I have no words. Why didn't you ever tell anyone you could play like that?" Eduardo shrugged slightly. No one ever asked, ma'am. The simple truth of this statement seemed to strike Mrs. Chen hard. She looked away for a moment, composing herself. Well, I'm asking now. Would you consider playing one more piece at the end of our showcase? As a finale? Eduardo hesitated. Part of him wanted nothing more than to retreat back into the shadows, to return to the comfortable invisibility of his daily routine. The spotlight, however warm, felt dangerous, a place where expectations would be created, where disappointment might follow. And yet the feeling of playing again, of being truly seen and heard after so many years, pulled at him with unexpected strength. I would be honored, he heard himself say. Mrs. Chen smiled broadly. Wonderful. Let me make the announcement. As she hurried back to the stage, Eduardo noticed a small crowd gathering nearby. Several students who had witnessed his performance were approaching cautiously, their faces curious and respectful in a way they had never been before. Mr. Rodriguez, a boy with a violin case, said hesitantly, "That was amazing. Where did you study?" "The National Conservatory in Mexico City," Eduardo answered, feeling strange saying the words aloud in this context. "Many years ago. Would you maybe give me some advice sometime about playing with more emotion?" asked a girl with long braids who Eduardo recognized as one of the piano students. Before he could answer, more students joined the conversation, asking questions about his technique, his favorite composers, how he memorized such complex pieces. Eduardo answered each question patiently, surprised by their genuine interest. For the first time in decades, he was being asked to share not just his labor, but his knowledge, his passion, his experience. The showcase continued, with Eduardo watching from the wings. He observed each student with new eyes, noting their technical skills and the moments where emotion broke through the performance anxiety. When the second-to-last student finished, Mrs. Chen returned to the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, to close our showcase today, we have a special treat. Please welcome back to the stage Mr. Eduardo Rodriguez." The applause as Eduardo walked out was immediate and enthusiastic. This time he moved to the piano with more confidence, adjusting the bench with deliberate care. He had decided to play a piece by Mexican composer Manuel Ponce, Intermezzo No. 1, the same piece he had played for Richard Harrington. It felt right to share this music from his homeland, a piece that spoke of both longing and hope. As the final notes of Eduardo's performance faded, the audience once again rose to their feet. This time Eduardo's bow was deeper, more assured. As he straightened, he noticed Victoria Harrington approaching the stage, her husband close behind her. Eduardo tensed slightly as Victoria reached the steps. She paused, seeming to gather herself, then climbed onto the stage and walked directly to him. The audience quieted, many remembering her public scolding of the janitor just days before. "Mr. Rodriguez," Victoria said, her voice carrying in the hushed auditorium. "I owe you an apology." Eduardo blinked in surprise. Victoria Harrington did not strike him as a woman who apologized often, if ever. "I spoke to you disrespectfully," she continued, "and made assumptions about you that were clearly wrong." She glanced at the audience, then back to Eduardo. "I'm sorry." The simple words, spoken publicly, seemed to cost her greatly. Eduardo could see the effort it took for this proud woman to acknowledge her mistake in front of so many witnesses. He nodded once, accepting her apology with quiet dignity. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrington," he said. "There is no need for forgiveness where there is understanding." Victoria looked startled by his response, as if she had expected resentment rather than grace. Before she could respond, Richard joined them on stage. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said warmly, extending his hand. "That was extraordinary, truly. I have a proposal for you if you're willing to hear it." Eduardo shook his hand, curious. "Of course." "The music department has been looking for an assistant teacher for some time now," Richard explained. "Someone to work with students who need extra help with technique, interpretation, performance anxiety, all the things that can't be taught from books." He glanced at his wife, who nodded slightly. "We'd like to offer you that position, in addition to your current role if you wish to keep it. The hours would be adjusted accordingly, of course, with appropriate compensation for your expertise." Eduardo stared at him, struggling to process the offer. I have no formal teaching credentials," he said finally. Richard smiled. "After what we just witnessed, I think your talent speaks for itself." Mrs. Chen agrees. He gestured to the music teacher, who was nodding enthusiastically from the side of the stage. "What do you say?" Eduardo's mind raced. Teaching music had been one of his dreams as a young man at the conservatory, before life had taken him in a different direction. To return to that path now, after all these years, I would need time to think about it, he said carefully. Of course. Richard nodded. Take all the time you need. As the Harringtons left the stage, Eduardo found himself surrounded by students and parents, all wanting to congratulate him or ask questions about his background. He answered politely but briefly, still processing the unexpected turn of events. Eventually, the crowd thinned as people began to leave the auditorium. Eduardo was gathering his cleaning supplies when Sophia approached him one last time. Did you mean what you said? She asked. About the silence between the notes? Eduardo nodded. Music is not just about playing the right notes at the right time. It's about what you put into those notes, your life, your feelings, your heart. Sophia considered this. I've been playing for 10 years, but I've never played like you did today. Not even close. You will, Eduardo said gently. When you have lived more, felt more, music comes from life, not just from practice. Will you teach me? Sophia asked suddenly. Even if my mother hadn't suggested it, I would want to learn from you. Eduardo was surprised. Your mother suggested this? Sophia nodded. It was her idea, actually. After your first performance, she whispered to my father that they needed to find a way to keep you playing. She smiled slightly. I think she recognized true talent, even if she didn't want to admit it at first. Eduardo looked across the now empty auditorium, his mind still trying to catch up with how dramatically his life had changed in the span of a single afternoon. I would be honored to teach you, Sophia, and any other student who wishes to learn. That evening, as Eduardo drove home, his phone rang. It was Lucia. Papa, I just got the strangest email from someone named Richard Harrington at your school. He says he heard you play piano today and wants to establish a scholarship in your name for music students who face financial hardships. Is this real? What happened today? Eduardo laughed, a sound of pure joy that had been too rare in his life. It's a long story, mija. A very long story. Tell me everything, Lucia insisted, and so, as he drove through the darkening streets toward his small apartment, Eduardo began to tell his daughter about his day, about how being seen, truly seen, had changed everything. 6 months later,
Eduardo stood in the newly renovated music wing of Westfield Academy.
A plaque on the wall read, Eduardo Rodriguez Performance Studio, beneath which hung a photograph of Eduardo at the piano during that fateful showcase. He now split his time between teaching music and overseeing maintenance for the school. With a significant increase in salary that had allowed him to move to a better apartment closer to campus, the studio was filled with students practicing for the fall recital. Eduardo moved among them, offering gentle corrections and encouragement. In the corner, Sophia was helping a younger student master a difficult passage, showing the same patience Eduardo had shown her. When everyone had left for the day, Eduardo sat alone at the piano, the same Steinway from the Grand Hall, which had been moved to his studio at Richard Harrington's insistence. His fingers found the keys without thought, playing a melody that had been forming in his mind for weeks. For the first time in decades, he was composing again, creating music that spoke of his journey from the conservatory to the maintenance halls and back to music again. Victoria Harrington paused in the doorway, listening. Her relationship with Eduardo had evolved into one of cautious respect over the months. That's beautiful, she said when he finished. I don't recognize it. It's new, Eduardo said simply. Something I'm working on. Victoria nodded, understanding more than he had said. The board approved your proposal for the community music program. Classes can begin next month. Thank you, Eduardo said, genuinely grateful. The program would offer free music lessons to children from the surrounding neighborhoods, taught by Westfield students under Eduardo's supervision. No, Victoria said quietly. Thank you. For showing all of us what we were missing. She hesitated. And for your forgiveness. As she left, Eduardo turned back to the piano, adding notes to the composition he had started. The piece was coming together. A story told in music about hidden talents and second chances, about the dignity of work and the power of being truly seen, about how sometimes life's most beautiful melodies emerge from the most unexpected places, if only we take the time to listen.